9/11 Truth movement challenges the peace movement. I'm going to follow an autobiographical thread. I've been a member of the peace movement in my country, Canada, for decades, while I've been a member of the 9/11 Truth movement for only 4 years. I hope to explain the way I, as a peace movement, have been challenged, and that this will somehow help other people in the peace movement to allow themselves to be challenged, to allow themselves to hear what people in the 9/11 Truth movement have been saying. This talk is addressed mainly to people in the peace movement, and especially those in the peace movement who don't really get it yet about 9/11 Truth. I know that that's not you folks here tonight, so I'm assuming and hoping that the videotape of this might get out to some people who need to see it. Okay. So, since we're autobiographical, I'm going to start in February 2001. I was in Peshawar, Pakistan, helping to put on a peacemaking workshop for Afghans. The workshop was led by peace researcher Johan Galtung, and I was there as a member of the Center for Peace Studies at McMaster University, where I was a university professor. Our host was the Afghan University in Peshawar. In other words, we always work with people in the region in question, in war zones, and in this case with a great many Afghans. This workshop went on for about 8 hours a day throughout 5 days. There were 100 participants, about a quarter of whom were former Afghan cabinet ministers. Most of the others were academics, leaders of NGOs, or journalists. There's a lot of interesting stuff that happened at that workshop, but I just want to mention 2 of them for you. The first is I'd like to report that during those 5 days, as well as 2 further days with NGOs and the United Nations, many ideas were put forward to help create a stable peace in Afghanistan, yet not a single person, guess what, proposed that a foreign invasion and occupation of Afghanistan was the way to go. Most of the people we talked with considered the Taliban their adversaries, yet none suggested the Taliban had no part whatsoever in a future Afghanistan. On the contrary, they proposed a peace process to involve the Taliban, which we do not have in 2009. I can't imagine, I'm speechless that at the Bonn process in December 2001, a so-called peace process went ahead which excluded the people who had controlled 95% of the country. And then they are surprised that there's an insurgency. Not one single woman that I talked to there or when I visited Afghanistan earlier called for military strikes to save them from the Taliban. Their dominant view expressed repeatedly that we needed to end war and the culture of war in Afghanistan, that every effort needed to be made to end it creatively and with as little destruction as possible. And the second thing I want to report to you, in addition to those comments, was one that puzzled me at the time. A well-dressed male participant, probably former Afghan cabinet minister, stood up after a nice brainstorming session about what Afghans could do to make their country more peaceful, and said, and I'm quoting from the notes on the conference, "The USA is right now planning a war in Afghanistan." Okay, this was 6 months before 9/11. "It's about oil and a base to protect their interests. They will build a base, they will be there for a long time, and unfortunately our discussions here today are of no avail." And then he sat down and there was silence. Given what we now know about foreknowledge of the fall 2001 invasion of Afghanistan, foreknowledge in Pakistan and India, it seems to me he wasn't just making a good guess. He was telling us what he'd learned, probably from Pakistani officials. In other words, he knew about the invasion of Afghanistan 7 months before it took place. We North Americans tend to talk a lot about our media, but of course our media didn't cover this, even though it was widely covered in India several months before the invasion. They said the United States will be invading in the fall. Well, I mentioned that fellow just to sort of say shame on me, because when 9/11 happened, I should have had a little bit of a head start in understanding it as compared with most people in North America. So did I cotton on right away in 9/11 that this was a very fishy event? I'm sad to say I didn't. Let me be more precise about that. I mean, I'd studied and taught war for years by then. I was involved deeply in the peace studies program at my university. I had been to Afghanistan. I had heard this guy. I had no difficulty at all understanding that 9/11 was going to be used as a false pretext for the invasion of Afghanistan. Not a cause of the invasion, but a pretext. I knew the invasion was convenient for U.S. elites, just as the later invasion of Iraq was convenient. 9/11 gave them the opportunity they sought, both to secure fossil fuel resources and to position military forces in strategic locations. This part I understood, okay? And in fact, I think most people in the peace movement understood it. But what I didn't get is that 9/11 was a fraudulent trigger incident of the most extreme kind. Barry Zwicker and I were talking, what do you call these different kinds of events? It may sound a little over-technical, but I think fraudulent trigger incident is a good general category, and there's a whole bunch of subcategories, one of which is false flag operation. And I didn't understand that 9/11 was a false flag operation. So I want to ask a question here. Why didn't I? Why didn't I explore this more? And I'm asking this because I think there are a lot of people still in the peace movement who haven't been questioning enough, and maybe their reasoning goes a little bit like mine. If I had to use one word to explain where I was coming from back then, just after 9/11, I would use the medical word triage. You know, in medical emergencies, you establish priorities as to who you're going to treat first, based on severity of injury and likelihood that they'll benefit from treatment. My top priority after 9/11 was to prevent a Western invasion of Afghanistan. I saw this as a continuation of the manipulation of this wretched country. In 1995, in Afghanistan, I talked to a well-known Mujahideen leader, Abdul Haq, who told me that the Soviet Union and the United States both had used Afghanistan like toilet paper. This was a bitter man. He'd lost his leg in battle. People had come to kill him to his house. He wasn't there. They killed his wife and son instead. Shortly after 9/11, he himself was assassinated. This is a bitter man. Like toilet paper, he said. And it seemed to me, as I watched the preparations for the invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11, that this belonged to the toilet paper tradition of Western foreign policy. Afghanistan was being used. Thank you. So I worked really hard to prevent that invasion. Of course, we failed, at least in the short run. We failed to stop it. It had been planned way in advance, and they were committed to doing it. What next? What after that? Well, my next priority was to try and stop the invasion of Iraq. It became very clear quickly that that was next on the hit list. 10 million of us were on the streets protesting that. But again, at least in the short run, we failed. And by the way, far from being radicals, as sometimes said in North America, there are lots of polls taken at the time that show that the great majority of the people in the world opposed both of those invasions. There wasn't anything particularly radical about it. We were going along with most people in the world, which said that a different route altogether needed to be taken to address 9/11. Now, I've said triage, I've said I was busy doing this and busy doing that, but why not at least look at 9/11 a little more closely? Here's what I think was going on in my mind, as well as I can reconstruct it. First, it was the obvious thing that to get 9/11 would distract me from my urgent peace tasks. I thought that it was possible 9/11 was a false flag operation, but that it was unlikely. And I thought that this is one of these things that might take the rest of my life to get to the bottom of. I pictured myself drowning in quicksand, reading arguments for, arguments against, wasting my time, spinning my